In order to examine a substantial change in Sino-American relations during the 70s, one must first discuss earlier diplomatic turmoil surrounding China and the United States. It began with the submission of Chinese nationalists to the communistic uprising led by Mao Zedong in 1949. Chiang Kai-shek, leader of the Chinese nationalists, had the support of President Franklin D. Roosevelt. In Kuomintang, the Chinese nationalists moved to Taiwan as the Communistic People's Republic of China formed. The U.S. protected independence-seeking Taiwan as China advocated reign over the province. Such issues lay as a foundation to the diplomatic conflict between the two powers. China labeled the U.S. as the common enemy of people throughout the world, and the Vietnam War added fuel to the fire. The Vietnam War raged with China supporting the communistic North and the U.S. aided the South in its resistance, mirroring previous events involving conflict in China. However, President Richard Nixon fought a battle against negative fervor in the U.S. stirred up by Vietnam. Seeking ties to China would ease tensions with the Soviet Union and pressure northern Vietnam into ending the war.
He could use the rivalry that developed between China and Russia intense during the 1960s to achieve his policy goal of ending the Vietnam War.
Chinese Premier Zhou Enlai's initial address explained that China would not commence war without the U.S.'s provocation. The Chinese did not seek war as a single solution. As a result of the failures of the Great Leap Forward in 1958 and the Cultural Revolution of China of 1965, China's economy began to deteriorate. The double blow of the Trading with the Enemy Act and the U.S.-Taiwan Mutual Defense Treaty inhibited China from trading with the U.S., while attempts to annex Taiwan weakened. The economic chaos accentuated by trade issues and looming Americans and Soviets compelled China to alter foreign policies. The animosity that held the countries apart now began to dissolve. Nixon sent his assistant for national security affairs, Henry A. Kissinger, on a secret trip to China to lay groundwork for a visit by Nixon himself. Despite Nixon's paranoia and the rising publicity of Kissinger, he was left without a choice. The meeting would culminate in diplomatic relations beneficial to both parties. Regarding this visiting issue, Mao Zedong portrayed his opinion toward Nixon's approach in a conversation with an American friend, Edgar Snow. Nixon may come quietly in a plane, either as a tourist or a president. I don't think I'll wrangle with him, though I'll criticize him. The first hint of diplomatic revolution occurred in Nagoya, Japan, during the 31st World Table Tennis Championships. An American ping pong player named Glenn Cohen exchanged words and gifts with Chinese player Zhang Zedong on a bus filled with Chinese players. The two became friends, initiating a thawing of icy relationships between America and China. With this news came what Time magazine called Ping heard around the world. Mao Zedong immediately invited the U.S. team on a trip of China. On April 10, 1971, 15 players and 5 journalists became the first Americans to step into China since 1949. Such diplomatic improvement may not have occurred without pressure from Russia and the table tennis championships, for China would have had no incentive in the affair. On February 21, 1972, the wheels of Air Force One touched down on the tarmac of the Beijing airport, welcomed by Chinese officials and officers. Foremost was Prime Minister Zhou Enlai. During Nixon's one-week stay, the conversation between the president and Mao Zedong and the banquet headed by Zhou Enlai was a subtle diplomatic exchange. In a memorandum of conversation, one receives a view of the scene at hand, characterized by a sharpness of Mao Zedong perceived through the text. Amidst light jokes, the topic of conflict with nationalist Chiang Kai-shek was brought up, then left. When Nixon further pressed on the issues of Taiwan, Vietnam, Korea, the future of Japan, and U.S.-Soviet relations, Mao attempted to skirt the discussion, passing it instead to the Prime Minister. He later expressed his distaste for all U.S. presidents from Truman through Johnson. In spite of what seems to be contempt toward negotiations with the U.S., their chairman agrees to focus on issues at hand, telling Nixon, The time is less than 10 months since we began playing table tennis. Here, Mao Zedong acknowledges the attempt at improving diplomatic relations. Nixon also asserts that although China and the US have differences in internal political philosophy, they must be set aside to consider the world situation. Second, Prime Minister Zhou Enlai made a toast at a banquet in the Great Hall of the People held in honor of Nixon. He spoke of the Chinese government's wish to maintain a relationship regardless of fundamental differences. Differences were precisely what rose to conflict, yet it was possible to establish peace. Zhou Enlai asserted that differences should not hinder new relations under terms of mutual respect, while the Chinese would be willing to discuss any issues. Although he had labeled his words as the common desire of the people, one takes into consideration the lack of an influential voice, like that of America, of the Chinese people whilst under communism. As they dined on mushrooms, sprouts, and roast duck, Dwight Chapman's recommendation for members of White House staff to learn chopstick use in preparation of the trip may have been useful after all. The final step occurred on February 27, 1972, in the mutual signing of the Shanghai Communique. The Chinese, though in want of an agreement, were wholly unprepared for the subject. The government even disagreed with the first draft of the U.S., which left troops in Taiwan. Eventually, a final draft was released. The two countries would work towards the normalization of diplomatic relationships, accepting the People's Republic of China and Taiwan as one single country. Tensions with Vietnam, Korea, and Japanese expansion were relaxed, maintaining that both sides were against hegemony in the region. The Communique brought to light two countries interested in peaceful relationships. Complement to a new beginning of Sino-American relations was China's gift of two half-year-old pandas for the U.S. In return, the U.S. sent a pair of musk oxen. China sent its table tennis team on a tour similar to that of the Americans. The team played exhibition matches with the U.S. players. The countries finally established liaison offices in 1973, fully securing diplomatic relations in 1979 as a conclusion to the well-played diplomacy. Now that relationship with China was sealed, another piece of diplomacy came into play. Nixon had struggled with strategic arms limitations talks with the Soviet Union in an unsuccessful attempt to gain leverage in the arms race. The U.S. had yet to force northern Vietnam into an agreement. China's diplomacy acted as a bargaining chip to pressure Russia and Vietnam. Months after the visit, Soviet Premier Brezhnev caved under pressure, signing the first nuclear weapons control agreement. After détente, China and Russia pressured northern Vietnam into a negotiation where the U.S. completely pulled out of Vietnam to settle the war. Nixon walked away from his weakened China with re-established Sino-American relations, recognizing China's legitimacy. The U.S.'s relations with China have turned from conflict into a progression of trade, tourism, and a pursuit of new technologies in an advancing world. We see the power of China today, exposed and helped along by diplomacy with the U.S. Ping-pong diplomacy, beginning with a small hand-to-hand exchange of gifts and ending with one across continents, sparked the repairing of relationships. Here we are given an apt example of an insignificant event creating a vast movement. Here we see two ideologically different nations unite, coming together for the situation of the world as a whole. Never before in history has a sport been used so effectively as a tool of international diplomacy. Prime Minister Zhou Enlai.